Sometimes the cruelest wounds aren't the ones that break your body, but the ones that break your heart when people you trusted walk away. Sarah Brennan learned that the hard way when a wagon accident left her paralyzed, and her fiancé abandoned her the very next day. The town of Willowbrook turned their backs too, leaving her alone in a wooden chair at the edge of town. Then Jacob Cole, a quiet mountain man, stopped by with firewood. He saw her drop a book and couldn't reach it. Something changed in him. He started visiting, fixing things, teaching her leatherwork. People laughed at him. But when floodwaters came to the valley, her courage and his devotion saved half the town. What made this silent man see worth where everyone else saw burden? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory sun hung low over Willowbrook in the autumn of 1878, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Sarah Brennan sat on the porch of her small cabin, positioned at the eastern edge of town, where the buildings gave way to prairie grass and distant mountains. Her wooden wheelchair, hand-carved by her late father years ago for her grandmother, now served a purpose neither of them could have imagined. She was 32 years old, though the past 6 months had added years to her face that had nothing to do with time. Her honey-colored hair, once worn in elaborate styles for church socials and town dances, now hung in a simple braid down her back. Her hands, which had once created the finest embroidery and tailoring in 3 counties, lay idle in her lap most days. The calluses from needlework had begun to fade, replaced by the different kind of wear that came from pushing wooden wheels and gripping armrests. The cabin had belonged to her father, Samuel Brennan, who'd run the general store on Main Street for 23 years before his heart gave out 2 winters past. He'd left Sarah the store, the cabin, and a modest savings that was slowly dwindling. She'd managed the store herself for a year and a half, proud and independent, engaged to Thomas Garrett, the son of the town's wealthiest merchant. Life had seemed so certain then. She'd known exactly how her future would unfold. Marriage in the spring, children within a few years, a comfortable life as a merchant's wife. She'd already started sewing her wedding dress, cream-colored silk, shipped all the way from San Francisco, with seed pearls she'd ordered from a catalogue. The dress still hung in her wardrobe, untouched, a ghost of the life she'd never have. The accident happened on a Tuesday in April. She'd been making a supply run to Copper Falls, the neighboring town 15 miles north, to pick up fabric orders and deliver finished alterations. The road was rutted from spring melt, and when her wagon wheel caught in a particularly deep groove, the whole rig tipped. She remembered the sensation of falling, the sky wheeling overhead, then the crushing weight of the wagon coming down on top of her. They told her later that a passing ranch hand found her 3 hours after it happened. Doc Morrison said it was a miracle she'd survived at all. The wagon had crushed her lower spine. She'd never walk again. Those were the words he'd used, gentle but final. Never again. Thomas had visited her every day during the first week of her recovery. He'd held her hand, told her everything would be fine, that they'd figure it out together. But as the days turned to weeks and the reality settled in, his visits grew shorter, more strained. He stopped meeting her eyes. By the 2nd month, he came only twice a week. By the 3rd month, once. The last time she saw him was 3 months ago in mid-June. He'd stood in this very cabin, hat in his hands, unable to look at her directly. He'd said all the expected things, that he cared for her, that this wasn't what he wanted, that he hoped she understood. But his family had expectations. His father's business needed a proper merchant's wife, someone who could host dinners and attend social functions and, eventually, give him children. Sarah had said nothing. She'd simply nodded, watched him place her grandmother's engagement ring on the table, and listened to his footsteps retreat across the porch. She hadn't cried until she heard his horse trot away down the road. The town's reaction had been slower, but just as crushing. At first, people had been kind. Meals appeared on her doorstep. Women from the church visited, bringing flowers and sympathy. But charity has a shelf life, and pity grows tiresome. As summer faded into autumn, the visits dwindled. The meals stopped coming. People still nodded to her if they passed her cabin, but they didn't stop to talk. They didn't meet her eyes. She understood in a distant way. She reminded them of their own vulnerability, their own mortality. A young woman, whole and healthy one day, broken the next. It frightened them. And fear often looks like avoidance. Her days had fallen into a routine of quiet survival. She woke with the sun, transferred herself from bed to chair using the rope and pulley system Doc Morrison had rigged up. She managed her personal needs as best she could, though the indignity of it still brought heat to her cheeks. She'd sold the general store to Thomas's father for far less than it was worth, having no way to run it anymore. The money helped, but it wouldn't last forever. Most mornings she sat on the porch, a blanket across her lap, watching the town wake up. She could see the main street from here, see people going about their business, living their lives, moving forward while she remained still. Her nearest neighbor, Mrs. Henley, stopped by once a week with bread and thinly veiled concern. The widow was kind in her way, but her visits felt more like obligation than genuine care. She'd ask the same questions. How are you managing, dear? Do you need anything? Are you eating enough? While her eyes scanned the cabin for signs of deterioration or scandal, the only true companion Sarah had left was Copper, her father's old hound dog. The animal was nearly as ancient as her wheelchair, with graying fur and stiff joints, but he never left her side. He slept at the foot of her bed at night and dozed on the porch beside her chair during the day. Sometimes she talked to him just to hear a voice in the silence, even if it was her own. On her lap now sat a leather-bound book, its pages worn soft from reading. Robinson Crusoe. Her father had given it to her when she was 12, after her mother died. Sometimes, he told her, we have to learn to survive on our own island. She hadn't understood what he meant then. She understood now. The book had been her companion through these long months. She'd read it so many times she could recite passages from memory. The story of a man cast away, forced to build a new life from nothing, resonated in ways it never had before. She too was marooned, stranded on an island of her own body's limitations, watching the world sail past just out of reach. Evening was settling over Willowbrook now, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The temperature was dropping. Soon it would be too cold to sit outside. Winter was coming, and with it new worries. How would she manage when the snow came? Her firewood supply was running low, and she had no way to chop more or haul it. She tried to hire someone from town, but the quotes were more than she could afford, and the looks of pity that came with them were worse than the cost. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and opened her book to a familiar page. Copper lifted his head, ears pricked, then settled back down with a soft woof. Probably just a rabbit in the brush. But then she heard it too. The creak of wagon wheels, the slow clip of hooves on packed earth. Someone was coming up the road toward her cabin. Sarah's hand tightened on her book. Visitors were rare these days, and unexpected ones even more so. She watched as a wagon emerged from the gathering dusk, pulled by a sturdy grey mare. The driver was a man, broad-shouldered and weathered, wearing a canvas coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. The wagon was loaded with split firewood, stacked neat and high. As it drew closer, Sarah recognized him, though they'd never spoken. Jacob Cole, the mountain man. The hermit who lived somewhere up in the high country and came to town maybe once a month for supplies. People said he'd been here for years but kept to himself. Some said he was running from something. Others said he was just peculiar, the way solitary men got when they spent too much time alone. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of her cabin, set the brake, and climbed down with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his body. He was probably in his mid-40s, though it was hard to tell with men who lived rough. His face was tanned and lined, his dark hair touched with grey at the temples. He had the kind of quietness about him that suggested depth rather than emptiness. "Evening," he said, his voice low and rusty from disuse. "Evening," Sarah replied. Uncertain, he gestured to the wood in his wagon. "Heard you might need firewood." "Brought some." Sarah's pride bristled immediately. Another charity case. Another person doing their good deed so they could feel better about themselves. I didn't order any firewood. I know. He was already moving toward the wagon bed, preparing to unload. But winter's coming and you'll need it. I can't afford, didn't ask for payment. He lifted a load of split logs as if they weighed nothing. Just seems like something that needs doing. Sarah wanted to protest further, but the truth was stark and undeniable. She did need the wood. She couldn't afford to let pride freeze her to death. "Thank you," she said finally, the words tight in her throat. He nodded once and went about his work, carrying load after load to her woodpile at the side of the cabin. He worked in silence, efficient and steady. Copper watched him with mild interest but didn't bark. Animals were good judges of character, Sarah's father used to say. She watched too, feeling useless and frustrated. This was her home, her responsibility, and she couldn't even stack her own firewood. The book in her lap suddenly felt heavier, and in a moment of distraction, it slipped from her fingers and tumbled to the porch floor. Sarah leaned forward instinctively, reaching, but the book had fallen too far to the right. Beyond the range, her arms could stretch from the chair. She strained, fingers outstretched, but it was useless. Tears of frustration pricked her eyes. Then Jacob was there, mounting the porch steps. He bent and retrieved the book, straightening slowly. He looked at the cover, then at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity. She'd learned to recognize pity. This was something else. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. He held the book out to her, and when she took it, their eyes met properly for the first time. "Good book," he said quietly. "You've read it?" She couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "Couple times." When learning to survive alone, he glanced away, toward the mountains darkening in the distance. "Seems fitting sometimes." Before she could respond, he turned and went back to his wagon. He finished unloading the wood, then stood looking at her cabin with an assessing eye. His gaze lingered on the porch ramp, warped and listing to one side, and on her wheelchair, where one of the wheels wobbled slightly. "That ramp's not safe," he said. "Wheel needs tightening too." "I manage," Sarah said, lifting her chin. "Didn't say you didn't." He pulled his hat down a bit. "But things work better when they're fixed right. I'll come back tomorrow, bring some tools. You don't have to—" "I know." He climbed back onto his wagon, gathered the reins. "But I will anyway." He clicked to the mare, and the wagon rolled forward. Sarah watched him go, confusion and something else, something she couldn't quite name, stirring in her chest. Copper whuffed again beside her, and she reached down to scratch his ears. The evening had turned strange, and winter was indeed coming. But her woodpile was full now, stacked neatly against the cabin wall, and for the first time in months, someone had looked at her and seen a person. Not a problem. She opened her book again, but the words wouldn't come into focus. Instead, she found herself watching the road where the wagon had disappeared, wondering about the quiet man who lived in the mountains and read about castaways learning to survive alone. Jacob Cole returned the next morning, just as he'd said he would. Sarah heard his wagon before she saw it, the familiar creak of wood and jangle of tools announcing his arrival. She'd been awake since dawn, having slept poorly, her mind turning over the unexpected encounter. She'd positioned herself on the porch early, telling herself it was just to enjoy the morning air. The lie was thin even to her own ears. The truth was, she'd been waiting, though she wouldn't have admitted it aloud. He pulled up with the same quiet efficiency as before, this time with a toolbox and several lengths of fresh-cut lumber in the wagon bed. Copper's tail thumped against the porch boards, a greeting the dog had never offered Thomas in all their months of courtship. "Morning," Jacob said, touching the brim of his hat. "Morning," Sarah replied. "You really didn't have to come back." "Told you I would." He was already unloading lumber, carrying it to the porch. Man should keep his word. There was no arguing with that simple statement, so Sarah didn't try. Instead, she watched as he set about examining the ramp, testing boards with his boot, running his hands along the support beams. His movements were methodical, purposeful. He wasn't a man who rushed or wasted motion. "Whole thing needs replacing," he said after a few minutes. "Wood's rotted through at the base. Surprised it hasn't collapsed already?" "I've been careful," Sarah said. "Careful only goes so far with bad wood." He pulled a measuring tape from his toolbox. I'll have it done by afternoon. Mr. Cole. Jacob, she corrected, the name feeling strange on her tongue. I appreciate the help truly, but I can't keep accepting charity. I have some money. Let me pay you for the materials at least. He paused in his measuring and looked at her directly. His eyes were dark brown, almost black and steady as stone. Didn't ask for payment yesterday, not asking today. Got plenty of lumber, and the work needs doing. That's all there is to it, but why? The question came out more forcefully than she intended. You don't know me. Why would you spend your time and materials on a stranger? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting past her toward the mountains. When he spoke, his voice was softer. Because I know what it's like when people stop seeing you, when they look right through you like you're already gone. He met her eyes again. And I know what it means when someone bothers to see you again. The raw honesty in his words struck something deep in Sarah's chest. She found herself nodding, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. Jacob turned back to his work, and Sarah retreated into the cabin to give him space. She busied herself with small tasks, straightening already straight shelves, folding already folded linens, anything to keep her hands occupied and her mind from dwelling on the kindness of a stranger when her own fiancé had walked away. Through the window, she watched him work. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd built things before, measuring twice, cutting once, each piece fitting together with precision. There was something almost meditative about the way he worked, a quietness that seemed to extend beyond mere silence. Around midday, Sarah prepared a simple lunch: bread, cheese, dried apples, and water. She carried it out on a tray balanced on her lap as she wheeled herself onto the new section of ramp he'd already completed. It was smooth and level, such a contrast to the old warped boards that the difference was almost startling. You should eat something, she said. Jacob straightened from his work, wiping sawdust from his hands. That's kind of you. They ate in companionable silence, sitting on the porch steps, him on the lower step, her in her chair positioned beside it. Copper dozed between them, enjoying the autumn sunshine. It was the most comfortable silence Sarah had experienced in months, free from the weighted awkwardness that usually accompanied other people's presence. How long have you lived in the mountains? She asked eventually. 5 years, give or take. And before that, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Different places. Different life. The wall that went up was gentle but firm. Sarah recognized it because she had her own walls, her own places she didn't want to examine too closely. She let the subject drop. What about you? He asked, surprising her. You grow up here? Born in St. Louis. My father brought us out here when I was 8. My mother died when I was 12. After that, it was just me and my father. She smiled slightly at the memory. He taught me how to run the store, how to keep books, how to deal with difficult customers. Said a woman needed to know how to stand on her own 2 feet. The irony of the last phrase hung in the air. Jacob's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been respect. Sounds like a wise man. He was. Sarah looked down at her hands. I wish he were here now. He'd know what to do. He always knew what to do. Maybe he taught you better than you think. Before Sarah could respond to that, the sound of hoofbeats approached from town. Both of them turned to see a rider coming up the road at a pace just shy of urgent. As he drew closer, Sarah's stomach dropped. Thomas Garrett. He pulled his horse up sharply at the edge of the yard, dust rising around the animal's hooves. His face was flushed. Whether from riding or anger, Sarah couldn't immediately tell. His gaze moved from her to Jacob and back again, his expression darkening. Sarah, he said, swinging down from his horse with less grace than Jacob had shown with his wagon. We need to talk. Thomas. She kept her voice level, though her heart had begun to race. What brings you out here? I think you know. He shot a pointed look at Jacob, who had risen slowly to his feet. The whole town's talking. Mrs. Henderson saw him here yesterday and now again today. People are concerned. Concerned about what exactly? Sarah's hands tightened on her chair's armrests. About your reputation. About what people will think. Thomas's voice carried the tone of someone who believed himself to be reasonable. This man, this stranger, spending time alone with you. It's not proper. Heat rose in Sarah's face, anger mixing with humiliation. Proper? You want to talk to me about what's proper? Sarah, he's repairing my ramp, Thomas. The ramp that's been falling apart for 3 months while I had no way to fix it myself. Her voice was rising now, months of suppressed hurt and anger finding an outlet. Where was your concern for propriety when you left me here alone? Where was the town's concern when I needed help and everyone turned away? That's not fair. We all have our own lives, our own responsibilities, and I had no right to expect anything from my fiancé? From the man who promised to marry me? Sarah's voice cracked, but she pushed on. You couldn't leave fast enough once you realized I'd never walk again. Don't you dare come here now and lecture me about propriety. Thomas's face had gone red. He made a difficult choice. My family has expectations, your family has a business, and I became a liability. Sarah's voice was cold now, the anger giving way to a bitter clarity. Just say it honestly, Thomas. You were ashamed of me. You didn't want a wife in a wheelchair. That's not, I never, Thomas stammered, but the truth was written on his face. He looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Jacob, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, spoke now. His voice was quiet, but carried an edge of something dangerous. I think the lady's made herself clear. You should go. Thomas's attention snapped to Jacob. This is between Sarah and me. You have no right. I have the right she gives me, Jacob said evenly. And right now, I'm standing on her property, doing work she's asked me to do. You're the one who doesn't belong here anymore. For a moment, Sarah thought Thomas might do something foolish. His hands clenched into fists, his chest puffing with indignation. But something in Jacob's stance, the easy balance, the readiness, made him reconsider. Thomas had probably never been in a real fight in his life. Jacob looked like he'd been in several and won them all. Thomas turned back to Sarah, his expression a mixture of anger and something that might have been wounded pride. You're making a mistake. When this goes wrong, don't come looking for sympathy. I won't, Sarah said quietly. I learned that lesson already. He mounted his horse in jerky, graceless movements, and rode back toward town at a gallop, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. Sarah's hands were trembling now that the confrontation was over. Adrenaline and emotion catching up with her. She'd never spoken to anyone like that before, never let her anger show so openly. Part of her was horrified at her own outburst, but another part, a part she'd thought broken in the accident, felt fiercely, vibrantly alive. Jacob settled back onto the porch step, picking up his sandwich as if nothing had happened. But she noticed his hands weren't quite steady either. I'm sorry, Sarah said. You shouldn't have been put in the middle of that. Nothing to apologize for. Man had it coming, speaking to you like that. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. Though I expect the whole town will know about this by sundown. They probably will. Sarah found herself almost smiling. Mrs. Henderson has a faster telegraph than the railroad. Does that bother you? What they'll say? Sarah considered the question. A week ago, even a day ago, the answer would have been yes. The thought of more gossip, more judgment, would have sent her spiraling into shame and isolation. But something had shifted in that confrontation with Thomas. Something had broken free. No, she said, surprised by the truth of it. I don't think it does anymore. Let them talk. I'm tired of living my life worried about what other people think of me. Jacob nodded slowly, and if she wasn't mistaken, there was approval in his expression. Good. Life's too short to spend it being small to make other people comfortable. They finished their lunch in silence. But it was different now, deeper. They'd been through something together. Stood together against judgment and criticism. It created a bond, fragile but real. When Jacob returned to his work on the ramp, Sarah stayed on the porch with her book. But she wasn't reading. She was thinking about walls and how sometimes they needed to come down. About standing firm even when you couldn't stand at all. And about a quiet mountain man who saw her as a person worth defending. By late afternoon, the ramp was complete, solid, level, and built to last through Wyoming winters. Jacob also tightened her wheelchair wheel, oiled the axles, and reinforced 2 of the support bars that had been working loose. Should hold you now, he said, packing his tools. "But if something breaks or needs adjusting, you let me know." "I will. Thank you, Jacob, for everything. Not just the repairs." He understood what she meant. He was wrong, you know. What he said to you. "You're not a mistake and you're not a burden. How do you know?" The question was barely a whisper, "Because I spent the day working beside you and I didn't feel burdened. I felt useful. There's a difference." He climbed onto his wagon, gathered the reins. "I'll be back in a few days. Got some leather scraps and tools I thought you might like. For working with your hands. Gives a person something to do besides think." He left before she could ask what he meant. The wagon rolling away toward the mountains as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Sarah sat on her new ramp, running her hand along the smooth, solid wood. Copper climbed into her lap, something he rarely did anymore, as if sensing she needed the comfort. She held the old dog close and let herself cry, not from sadness this time, but from something closer to relief. Someone had seen her. Someone had stood up for her. And for the first time since the accident, she felt like maybe, just maybe, her life wasn't over. It was just different now, and different didn't have to mean less. The Robinson Crusoe book sat on her lap beneath Copper's warm weight, its leather cover worn soft from years of handling. A man learning to survive alone. But maybe, she thought, survival didn't always have to be solitary. Maybe sometimes, if you were lucky, someone else washed up on your island too. 2 weeks passed before Jacob returned, and in that time, Sarah learned that silence could be louder than gossip. The town's reaction to Thomas's visit spread exactly as predicted, rippling through Willowbrook like creek water after rain. But instead of the whispered scandal she'd expected, there was mostly just quiet. People still didn't visit. They still didn't stop to talk. But now there was something else in their avoidance. Uncertainty, perhaps. Or maybe discomfort at having their own judgments reflected back at them. Sarah found she didn't much care either way. The confrontation with Thomas had burned away something inside her, some need for their approval she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. What remained felt cleaner, lighter. She was alone, yes, but she was choosing it now rather than having it imposed upon her. When Jacob's wagon appeared again on a crisp October morning, her heart lifted in a way that surprised her. She'd been watching the road more often than she wanted to admit, wondering if he'd truly come back or if that too had been just another temporary kindness. But here he was, and this time the wagon bed held something different, a wooden crate and a canvas bag bulging with contents. "Morning," he said, that same slight touch to his hat brim. "Morning," Sarah replied, unable to keep the smile from her voice. "I was starting to think the mountain had swallowed you up." Takes time to gather the right materials. He lifted the crate with easy strength and carried it to the porch. "Wasn't sure what you'd want to work with, so I brought options." Sarah wheeled closer as he opened the crate. Inside lay an assortment of leather pieces, some thick and rough, others thin and supple, in various shades of brown and tan. There were also tools, punches, stamps, needles, and several small mallets. The canvas bag held spools of heavy thread, beeswax, and what looked like pattern templates. "Jacob, this is too much. It's scraps mostly, left over from other projects. Just sitting in my workshop collecting dust." He pulled out a piece of medium-weight leather, running his thumb across its surface. "Seemed like you might have use for it. I don't know the first thing about leather work. Neither did I when I started. It's just patience and practice." He settled onto the porch step, arranging tools between them. "Here, I'll show you the basics." What followed was a lesson unlike any Sarah had experienced. Jacob's teaching style was mostly demonstration with sparse narration. He'd show her how to hold a punch, how to strike it cleanly, how to read the grain of the leather. His instructions were brief but precise, and he had a patience that seemed infinite. Sarah's first attempts were clumsy. Her hands, weakened from months of disuse, struggled to grip the tools properly. The punch slipped, leaving an uneven hole. The stamp went crooked, marring the pattern. Frustration built in her chest, familiar and suffocating. "My hands won't do what I want them to," she said, setting down the mallet harder than necessary. They're useless. Jacob looked at the leather piece she'd been working on, then at her hands. They made that hole, didn't they? And that stamp mark? Oh, badly. But they did it. He picked up the leather, examined it. First time I tried leather work, I punched clean through my own thumb. Bled all over a perfectly good hide. He showed her a small scar on his left thumb. Hands learn. Just takes time. You're just being kind. No, I'm being truthful. There's a difference. He set a fresh piece of leather in front of her. Try again. This time don't think about making it perfect. Just think about making it. Sarah picked up the tools again, taking a breath. This time, when she placed the punch, she focused only on the motion, the angle, the strike, the follow-through. The hole wasn't perfect, but it was better, straighter. There, Jacob said quietly. See? They worked through the morning, Sarah practicing basic techniques, while Jacob fashioned a simple belt beside her. His hands moved with practiced ease, and she found herself watching the way he worked, the economy of motion, the quiet concentration. There was something almost meditative about it. Where did you learn this? She asked. My father was a saddle maker. Grew up in his shop, learning the trade. His hands paused briefly. Seemed like I'd follow in his footsteps, but life had other plans. What happened? He was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Then I got restless. Wanted to see what was beyond our town. Joined up, saw some things, did some things. By the time I came back, my father had passed, and the shop was sold. Seemed fitting somehow. There was weight in those words, stories untold and deliberately kept that way. Sarah recognized the shape of grief, even when it wore the mask of acceptance. I'm sorry, she said. Long time ago now. He returned to his work, closing that door as gently as he'd opened it. What about your father? You said he taught you the store business. He did. Said a woman needed to know how to stand on her own. The irony brought a bitter smile to her lips. He died 2 winters ago. Heart just gave out one night. I found him in the morning, already cold. That's a hard thing, it was. Still is sometimes. Sarah's hands stilled on the leather. He was all I had left of my mother, of our family. After he died, I thought at least I had Thomas, had the store, had a future. Then the accident took all of that too. The accident didn't take Thomas. He left on his own. The distinction struck her as important, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Jacob was right. Thomas hadn't been taken from her. He'd chosen to go. They fell back into comfortable silence, working side by side. By midday, Sarah had successfully punched a row of even holes along a leather strip and stamped a simple border pattern. It wasn't beautiful, but it was hers, made by her own hands, which suddenly didn't feel quite so useless. I did this, she said, wonder creeping into her voice. You did. Jacob examined her work with the same serious attention he'd given his own. Got good rhythm to it. Pattern's consistent. Really? Don't lie about craft. Either it's done right or it isn't. This is done right. He stood, stretching his back. You keep practicing. I'll bring more leather next time, and we can start on something more complex. Maybe a coin purse or a small bag. Next time? Sarah looked up at him. You're coming back? If that's all right with you, it is. Very much so. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement that went beyond words. This was becoming something, not quite friendship yet, but the foundation of it. Two people who understood loss and solitude, finding unexpected companionship in the work of their hands. Jacob gathered his tools, leaving the crate and canvas bag with Sarah. Keep these. Practice when you feel like it. No pressure, no expectations. Just something to do when the quiet gets too loud. He knew about that too, she realized. About how silence could become oppressive, how the mind could turn against itself when left too idle. Thank you, Jacob, for all of this. He nodded, climbed onto his wagon. See you next week. Sarah watched him go, then looked down at the leather in her lap. The holes she'd punched, the pattern she'd stamped. Evidence of capability, of creation. Her hands had made something. After months of feeling broken and useless, she'd made something. She spent the afternoon practicing, working until her hands ached and the sun began its descent. Copper dozed beside her chair, occasionally opening one eye to check on her before settling back to sleep. The pile of practice pieces grew, some better than others. but each one teaching her something new about tension, pressure, angle. As evening approached, Mrs. Henley appeared on her weekly visit, carrying her usual offering of bread. She stopped at the base of the new ramp, taking in the solid construction with obvious surprise. "Well," she said, climbing up carefully, "this is certainly an improvement." "Jacob Cole built it," Sarah said, not bothering to hide the source. Mrs. Henley's lips pursed slightly. "Yes, I'd heard he'd been around." "There's been talk." "I imagine there has been." The older woman settled into the chair Sarah kept on the porch for visitors, though it was rarely used anymore. She watched Sarah work the leather for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "What are you making?" she asked finally. "Practicing mostly." "Learning leatherwork. I didn't know you knew how." "I didn't. Jacob's teaching me." Sarah met Mrs. Henley's gaze directly. "He's been kind when most people haven't been." Mrs. Henley had the grace to look uncomfortable. "People don't always know what to say, dear. Your situation, my situation is that I can't walk. Everything else, the isolation, the loneliness, the feeling of being invisible, that's not my situation. That's other people's choice." Sarah's voice was calm but firm. "Jacob sees me as a person, not a problem. That's why he's welcome here." "I see." Mrs. Henley was quiet for a moment. "He lost his family, you know. His wife and daughter. Fever took them both within days of each other. That's why he went to the mountains. Couldn't bear the memories here in town." Sarah's hands stilled on the leather. Jacob had mentioned loss, but not the details. "Not the full weight of it. How long ago?" 5 years, give or take. "He was different before. Smiled more, talked more. After they died, it was like he died too, in a way. Just kept breathing out of habit." Mrs. Henley stood, brushing her skirts. "I suppose two broken people might understand each other better than most." She left, before Sarah could decide whether that was meant as criticism or observation. But the words lingered, mixing with the growing understanding of who Jacob Cole was beneath his silence. Two broken people. Maybe that was true. But sitting there with the leather in her hands and the solid ramp beneath her chair, Sarah thought maybe broken wasn't the right word. Changed, certainly. Wounded, yes, but not beyond repair. She looked at the leather strip she'd been working on, at the neat row of holes and the careful stamping. It wasn't perfect, but it held together. It served its purpose. Sometimes, she thought, that was enough. Over the next few days, Sarah fell into a new routine. Mornings were for household tasks and the necessary work of maintaining herself and her small home. Afternoons were for leather. She practiced the techniques Jacob had shown her, working until her hands grew tired, but never quite giving up. The pile of finished practice pieces grew, and with each one, her confidence grew too. She found herself thinking about Jacob more than she probably should. About the stories hidden in his silence, the loss that drove him to the mountains, the quiet strength in his patient teaching. There was something solid about him. Something trustworthy in a way that had nothing to do with words or promises. He simply did what he said he would do, no more and no less. When he returned the following week, Sarah had a surprise waiting. She'd taken her best practice pieces and assembled them into a simple belt, punching and stitching with painstaking care. It wasn't pretty. The stitches were uneven in places, and the leather showed marks from uncertain tools. But it was complete and functional. Jacob examined it with his usual serious attention, running his fingers along the stitching, testing the strength of the joins. "You made this." "I did. It's rough, I know. It's good work." He looked at her with something that might have been pride. "Real good work for your first piece. Most people give up before they finish anything." The warmth that spread through Sarah's chest at his words surprised her with its intensity. When was the last time someone had been proud of her? Not pitying, not patronizing, but genuinely pleased by something she'd accomplished. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for teaching me, for seeing what I could do instead of what I couldn't." Jacob nodded, understanding passing between them. Then he reached into his wagon and pulled out a larger piece of leather, this one already cut into a pattern, ready to try something more complicated. They worked through the afternoon, Sarah learning new stitches and techniques as they assembled a small drawstring pouch. Copper had taken to greeting Jacob with tail wags now. and even accepted scratches behind his ears from the mountain man's weathered hands. As the sun began to set, Jacob produced something from his coat pocket, a small carved wooden figure no bigger than Sarah's palm. It was a dog, unmistakably copper, captured in wood with remarkable detail. "Made this last week," he said, handing it to her. "Thought you might like it." Sarah held the carving gently, marveling at the skill evident in every line. "Jacob, this is beautiful. You made this?" "Whittling passes the time in winter. Got a whole cabin full of animals, nobody to give them to." He shrugged, but there was pleasure in his eyes at her reaction. "Figured copper deserved to be immortalized." "Thank you." Sarah ran her thumb over the smooth wood. "I'll treasure this." They sat in comfortable silence as the evening deepened, two people who'd learned that sometimes the best company was the kind that didn't require constant conversation. Sometimes presence was enough. Early November brought the first real snow, not the light dusting that melted by afternoon, but heavy, wet flakes that accumulated in earnest. Sarah woke to find the world transformed, everything softened and quieted under a blanket of white. The sight filled her with both wonder and apprehension. Winter meant isolation, difficulty, danger. But when Jacob arrived that afternoon, he brought more than just his tools and steady presence. He'd modified her wheelchair in his workshop over the past few days, and now he unveiled the improvements with quiet pride. "Spent some time working on this," he said, gesturing to the chair. "Wider wheels with better traction, leather supports for your back and arms, and this." He demonstrated a brake mechanism he'd installed. "Locks the wheels so you won't slide on ice or snow." Sarah ran her hands over the modifications, marveling at the craftsmanship. Every change was thoughtful, designed to make her life easier and safer. The leather supports were tooled with a simple but elegant pattern, functional beauty. "Jacob, this must have taken you days." "Took what it took." "Needed doing." He helped her transfer into the modified chair, adjusting the supports until they fit perfectly. "Try it out." Sarah wheeled down the ramp, and the difference was immediately apparent. The chair moved more smoothly, the wheels gripped better, and the support made sitting for long periods far more comfortable. She turned circles in the snow-dusted yard, laughing with the simple joy of improved mobility. "It's wonderful." "Thank you." Jacob nodded, but she could see the pleasure in his eyes. "Now you can get around better, even in winter. Won't be trapped inside." The word trapped resonated. He understood what it meant to feel imprisoned, whether by disability or grief or the judgment of others. In giving her better mobility, he was giving her freedom. Over the next few days, Sarah tested the limits of her new independence. She ventured further from her cabin than she'd dared since the accident, wheeling along the relatively flat paths near her property. The world looked different from her chair, lower, more intimate with the ground, but no less beautiful. She watched squirrels preparing for winter, studied the patterns of bare branches against grey sky, felt the bite of cold air on her face, and called it living. On one such venture, she made it all the way to the edge of town proper, to her father's old general store. The building looked the same from the outside, though the sign now read, "Garrett and Son Mercantile." Her chest tightened, but she pushed forward, navigating the ramp that led to the entrance. Inside, the store was both familiar and strange. The layout had changed, new merchandise replacing her father's careful arrangements. Thomas's mother stood behind the counter, and her expression when she saw Sarah was a complicated mixture of surprise and discomfort. "Sarah," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected. Mrs. Garrett." Sarah kept her voice equally neutral. "I came to purchase some supplies. Thread, needles, and beeswax, if you have it." "Of course." The older woman gathered the requested items with stiff efficiency. "I hear your leather work has been selling well." "It has." "Thank you. Mr. Patterson speaks highly of the quality." Mrs. Garrett wrapped the items in brown paper. "It's good that you found something to occupy your time." The words might have been meant kindly, but Sarah heard the subtext, that leather work was a suitable occupation for someone who couldn't do anything else. She bit back a sharp response and simply paid for her supplies. As she turned to leave, Mrs. Garrett spoke again. Thomas is engaged to Catherine Morrison, the doctor's niece. They'll marry in the spring. The information landed like a stone in Sarah's stomach, but the pain was distant, muted. Thomas felt like someone from another lifetime now, a person she'd been when she was someone else entirely. "I wish them well," Sarah said, and meant it. Thomas deserved happiness, and she no longer wanted to be part of his story. She left the store with her head high, wheeling through the snow-dusted street. Several townspeople saw her, and their reactions varied. Some nodded politely, others looked away. But Sarah found she didn't care as much as she once had. Their approval or disapproval no longer defined her worth. She was halfway home when Jacob's wagon appeared on the road, heading into town. He pulled up alongside her, concern evident in his expression. "You all right?" "That's a long way from the cabin." "Testing the chair's limits," Sarah said, patting the armrest. "And my own," understanding dawned in his eyes. "Want a ride back?" "Actually, I'd like to make it on my own." "But walk with me." Jacob tied his horse to the back of the wagon and fell into step beside her as she wheeled along the road. They didn't talk much, but his presence was comforting, a steady anchor as she processed what had happened in the store. "Thomas is getting married," she said finally. "To the doctor's niece." Jacob glanced at her.
"How do you feel about that?"
"I thought it would hurt more than it does. But mostly I just feel relieved. Like the last thread connecting me to who I used to be finally snapped." She looked up at him. "Is that strange?" "No. Sometimes letting go is the only way to move forward." They walked in silence for a while, the snow crunching under his boots and her wheels. When they reached her cabin, Jacob helped her inside and started a fire in the stove to chase away the cold. "Stay for supper?" Sarah asked. "It's the least I can do after you walked all that way with me." Jacob hesitated, and Sarah saw the internal debate play out on his face. They'd shared meals before, but something about this invitation felt different, more deliberate. Finally he nodded. "That'd be nice." Sarah prepared a simple meal, venison stew from meat Jacob had brought her the week before, bread she'd baked that morning, and coffee. They ate at her small table, Copper dozing nearby, the fire crackling warmly. "Tell me about your wife," Sarah said gently. "If you want to. Mrs. Henley mentioned her, but I'd rather hear from you." Jacob was quiet for so long, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, his voice soft but steady. "Her name was Anna. Met her when I was stationed at the fort before I left the military. She was the laundress's daughter, and she had this laugh that could light up a whole room." A faint smile touched his lips. "We married quick, maybe too quick by some people's standards. But when you know, you know. You were in the military? Army Corps of Engineers. Built bridges, roads, fortifications. Anything that needed engineering in rough country." He stirred his stew absently. "Spent years at it before I met Anna. She made me want to settle down, stop moving from post to post. And your daughter?" "Emma. She was 3 when the fever came. Looked just like her mother. Same dark hair, same laugh." His voice grew rougher. "They got sick within a day of each other. Doc Morrison did everything he could, but frontier medicine only goes so far. Anna died first. Emma hung on 2 more days, kept asking for her mama." Sarah's throat tightened with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Jacob. Worst part wasn't losing them, as terrible as that was. It was after, when everyone kept telling me God's planned this, and everything happens for a reason, that, like there was some grand design that required taking a woman and a child who'd never hurt anyone." His jaw tightened. Couldn't stomach the pity, the platitudes. "So I left and went to the mountains. Seemed like the only place where silence wasn't uncomfortable, where I could grieve without performing grief for other people's comfort." Sarah understood that completely. After her accident, everyone had expected her to be brave, to stay positive, to be an inspiration. No one wanted to see the rage or the despair or the ugly parts of survival. They wanted neat, comfortable grief that didn't challenge their worldview. "Is that why you came back to town eventually?" "Because the silence got too heavy, partly. Mostly I realized Anna would have hated what I'd become. She always said life was for living, even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts." He looked at Sarah directly. "Meeting you reminded me of that. Watching you fight to rebuild your life, to find purpose again. It's been a reminder that surviving isn't the same as giving up. The intimacy of the conversation felt both terrifying and essential. They were moving into new territory, acknowledging things that had been carefully unspoken between them. "I'm falling in love with you," Sarah said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that." "It's not fair to put that on you, Sarah." Jacob reached across the table and took her hand. "You think I come here 3 times a week, spend hours teaching you and working on your cabin, just out of charity? I don't know. I hoped, but I'm not. I can't." She struggled to articulate the fear. "Jacob, I'll never walk again. I'll always need help with things. I'll always be limited. Why would you want?" "Because you remind me what it means to be alive," he said simply. "Because you're brave and stubborn, and you refuse to let the world tell you what you're worth. Because when I'm with you, I don't feel like a ghost anymore." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "I'm falling for you too. Have been for weeks." Was just too much a coward to say it. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they weren't tears of grief or frustration. They were something closer to joy, to relief, to the overwhelming gratitude of being truly seen and chosen. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Me too." Terrified. Jacob stood, came around the table, and knelt beside her chair so they were eye level. "But maybe being scared together is better than being safe and alone." He kissed her then, gentle and tentative, a question more than a statement. Sarah answered by kissing him back, her hands coming up to frame his weathered face. It was her first kiss in over a year, and it felt like coming home and setting out on a journey all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were trembling slightly. Jacob rested his forehead against hers, and they stayed that way for a long moment, breathing the same air, adjusting to this new reality between them. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. "I don't know. Figure it out as we go, I suppose." He pulled back enough to look at her. "But I'd like to keep coming around if that's all right with you. Not just to teach or help with repairs. Just to be with you. I'd like that. Very much." They spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking, in ways they hadn't quite managed before. Jacob told her more about his years in the Corps, about the places he'd been and things he'd built. Sarah shared memories of her mother, of growing up in her father's store, of dreams she'd had before the accident and new dreams forming now. When Jacob finally left, well after dark, something fundamental had shifted between them. They'd acknowledged the truth that had been building for weeks, given voice to feelings that could no longer be ignored. The future was uncertain, complicated, maybe even difficult. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she had a future worth wanting. Late November brought rain, unusual for this time of year in Wyoming territory. Not the light drizzle of autumn, but steady, drenching downpours that turned the roads to mud and sent the creek running high and fast. Jacob grew increasingly concerned, checking the water levels every time he came to town, studying the mountains with a worried eye. "It's not right," he said one afternoon, standing at Sarah's porch and watching dark clouds gather over the peaks. This much rain, this late in the season, with all that snow accumulating up high. The ground's already frozen, can't absorb the water. It's all running downhill. "Is it dangerous?" Sarah asked. "Could be. If the temperature spikes and all that mountain snow starts melting at once, with this rain on top of it." He shook his head. "Creek could flood. Maybe bad. Should you tell someone?" "The town council?" Jacob's expression turned bitter. "They wouldn't listen to me. Hermit from the mountains, warning about floods? They'd laugh me out of the meeting. But if people are in danger—" "I know." He rubbed his face tiredly. "I'll think about it. Maybe Doc Morrison would listen at least." But before Jacob could act on that thought, Sarah insisted on something she'd been working up the courage to suggest for days. "I want to see your cabin," she said. "Your mountain home. I want to see where you live, understand that part of your life." Jacob looked uncertain. "It's rough country, Sarah. The trail's not easy, even with the modifications to your chair. I trust you to get me there safely. Please, Jacob, I need to see all of you, not just the parts that fit into my world." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. Tomorrow, if the weather holds. But we'll need to leave early, and you'll have to let me carry you for some of it. I can do that." The next morning dawned grey but dry. Jacob arrived with his wagon and an extra horse on lead. He'd brought thick blankets and a canvas tarp, preparing for any weather. The journey up the mountain trail took over 2 hours, the path winding through pine forests and along rocky outcroppings. When the trail grew too rough for the wagon, Jacob transferred Sarah to his horse, holding her securely in front of him while he led the other horse carrying her wheelchair and supplies. Sarah had never been this high in the mountains. The air was thinner, colder, scented with pine and snow. The world felt vast and wild up here, untamed by human ambition. She understood immediately why Jacob had chosen this place for his exile. It demanded nothing of him except existence. His cabin appeared around a bend in the trail, nestled in a small clearing with a stream running nearby. It was larger than she'd expected, well built from logs he'd clearly cut and fitted himself. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she realized he must have come up earlier to start a fire. Jacob helped her down from the horse and into her wheelchair, then wheeled her up a ramp. He'd built one here too. She noticed, perhaps hoping she'd one day visit. The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable. One large room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, a workbench covered with tools and half-finished carvings. Furs and quilts covered a wide bed in the corner. Books lined a shelf near the fireplace, more than she'd expected, but what caught her attention most were the carvings. They were everywhere. Small animals covering every surface, intricate scenes carved into the support beams, delicate figures arranged on the mantel. Years of solitary work, beauty created for no one but himself. "Jacob, these are extraordinary," she breathed, picking up a carved owl with feathers so detailed she could count them. "Why didn't you tell me you could do this?" "Just something to do with my hands." Passes the time, but she could see he was pleased by her reaction. As Sarah explored what she could reach from her chair, Jacob made coffee and laid out a simple lunch. They ate by the fire, and Sarah felt the peace of this place seeping into her bones. No wonder he'd survived up here. There was a rightness to the solitude that was almost holy. "I understand now," she said quietly. "Why you came here. Why you stayed. Do you? It's not running away. It's like finding the one place in the world where you can hear yourself think, where grief doesn't have to perform for anyone's comfort." Jacob nodded, something like relief crossing his face. "That's exactly it. After Anna and Emma died, everyone wanted me to grieve a certain way. Be strong but not too strong. Sad but not depressing. Move on but not forget." He stared into the fire. "Up here, I could just feel what I felt without worrying about making anyone else uncomfortable." December first dawned with unseasonably warm air pushing through the valley, and Jacob arrived at Sarah's cabin before sunrise, his face grim, temperatures rising fast. "The snow up high is melting." He carried in his leather satchel stuffed with documents and charts. "We need to move today. Present everything to Doc Morrison, then the town council. Don't wait any longer." Sarah was already dressed, having barely slept. Together they organized the materials, Jacob's engineering credentials, his detailed measurements of creek levels, calculations showing the flood potential, even sketches of how the water would flow through town based on topography. "This is solid work," Sarah said, reviewing the diagrams. "Anyone with sense will see you know what you're talking about." "Sense and willingness to listen aren't always the same thing," Jacob replied. But he squeezed her hand gratefully. They made their way to Doc Morrison's house, Jacob pushing Sarah's wheelchair through streets still quiet with early morning. The doctor answered his door in his dressing gown, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Jacob, Sarah, bit early for a social call." "This isn't social," Jacob said. "We need you to look at something." "It's urgent." Doc Morrison's expression shifted to professional concern. He ushered them into his study and listened intently as Jacob laid out his case. The engineering documents caught the doctor's attention immediately. "I had no idea you had this background," Morrison said, examining the credentials. "Army Corps of Engineers, senior engineer with flood control specialization." He looked up sharply. "This is legitimate?" "All of it." Spent 15 years in the Corps before I mustered out. Jacob spread his measurements and charts across the desk. And based on these readings, Willowbrook is looking at a significant flood event, possibly within the next 72 hours if the weather pattern holds. Doc Morrison studied the data with growing alarm. Unlike the town council members, who were primarily merchants and landowners, Morrison had medical training. He understood data, scientific observation, cause and effect. These creek-level measurements, he said, pointing to Jacob's charts. You've been tracking them for weeks? Months, actually. Started noticing unusual patterns back in September. But it's accelerated dramatically in the past 2 weeks with this warm rain. And this map showing water flow through town, you're saying the school, the church, most of Main Street, all in the direct path. Yes, the town was built in a natural floodplain. In normal conditions, it's fine. But these aren't normal conditions. Jacob's finger traced the route the water would take. When the creek overflows, and it will overflow, the water will follow this path. Everything in its way will be at risk. Sarah watched Doc Morrison's face as the reality sank in. She saw the moment he made the decision to believe them. The council needs to see this, Morrison said firmly. Today, I'll call an emergency meeting. Will they listen? Sarah asked. They'll listen to me. And once they see these credentials, these measurements, he gathered the papers carefully. This isn't hysteria or guesswork. This is expert analysis backed by data. They'll have to take it seriously, but convincing the town council proved more difficult than Doc Morrison anticipated. The emergency meeting was held that afternoon in the church, and the 5 council members filed in with expressions ranging from curious to irritated at having their day interrupted. Thomas's father, Howard Garrett, led the council. His face hardened when he saw Jacob and Sarah seated at the front of the room. Doc Morrison, he said stiffly, I understood this was an urgent matter of public safety. I didn't realize we were being called together for... He gestured dismissively toward Jacob and Sarah. Whatever this is, it is an urgent matter of public safety, Morrison replied firmly. And I suggest you hear what Mr. Cole has to say before you make any judgments. Jacob stood, his military bearing evident as he faced the council. He distributed copies of his documentation, then began his presentation with calm, professional precision. He explained his background, showed his credentials, walked them through the data. Sarah watched the council members' faces as Jacob spoke. Morrison was already convinced. Blacksmith Tom Henderson looked increasingly concerned. Mill owner George Patterson was studying the charts with serious attention. But Howard Garrett and his ally, banker Samuel Wright, remained skeptical, their expressions closed. This is all very impressive, Mr. Cole, Garrett said when Jacob finished. But you're asking us to take drastic action based on speculation. It's not speculation. It's analysis based on measurable data. Jacob kept his voice level, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. The creek is already 15% higher than normal for this time of year. Mountain snowmelt is accelerating due to unseasonably warm temperatures. The ground is frozen and can't absorb runoff. These factors create optimal conditions for flash flooding. But you can't guarantee a flood will occur, Wright interjected. You're predicting, not proving. Engineering is about understanding systems and predicting outcomes based on evidence. Yes, I'm predicting. But I'm predicting based on 15 years of experience building flood control systems across the frontier. Experience you abandoned 5 years ago, Garrett said coldly. Along with this community after your personal tragedy. The room went silent. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest at the cruelty of the comment, but Jacob's expression didn't change. My personal life has no bearing on the validity of this data, he said quietly. The creek-level measurements are facts. The topography maps are facts. The weather patterns are facts. You can question my motives all you want, but you can't argue with the evidence. I can question whether this is really about public safety, Garrett continued, or about a man trying to regain relevance by causing panic. Sarah couldn't stay silent any longer. Mr. Garrett, Jacob has nothing to gain from warning you. He lives in the mountains. His property isn't at risk. He's trying to help people who've shown him nothing but judgment and suspicion. The least you can do is consider his warning seriously. Miss Brennan, Garrett's tone was patronizing. I understand your loyalty to Mr. Cole, but this council makes decisions based on logic and community interest, not personal relationships. Then use logic, Sarah shot back. Look at the data he's provided. Look at his credentials. What does it cost to prepare? A few days of inconvenience, moving valuables to higher ground, being ready to evacuate if necessary. Compare that to the cost if he's right and you do nothing. Tom Henderson spoke up. The lady has a point, Howard. My shop is in the lower town. If there's even a chance of flooding, I'd rather be prepared and cause panic, disrupt business, based on the warnings of a hermit and a... Garrett caught himself, but the damage was done. Everyone knew what he'd been about to say. A cripple, based on the warnings of an experienced Army Corps engineer, Doc Morrison said sharply, supported by measurable evidence. I vote we take this seriously. The council deliberated for another hour, tempers rising as the debate continued. Finally, they called for a vote. 3-2. They would acknowledge the potential risk and advise residents to be watchful. But no mandatory evacuation. No emergency measures. It was a compromise that satisfied no one. But it was better than nothing. As people filed out of the meeting, Jacob gathered his papers with tight, controlled movements. Sarah could see the frustration in every line of his body. At least it's something, she said quietly. It's not enough. When that flood comes, and it will come, 3 council members voting to be watchful won't save anyone. Doc Morrison joined them. You did what you could, Jacob. The warning is out there now. Some people will listen. Some isn't everyone. No, but it's better than none. Morrison put a hand on Jacob's shoulder. Start talking to people directly, those who trust you. Build a network of families who are willing to prepare, even if the council won't mandate it. Over the next 2 days, that's exactly what they did. Jacob and Sarah went door to door to every family they thought might listen. Some slammed doors in their faces. Others listened politely, but clearly didn't believe. But a few, 20 families, maybe 25, took them seriously. They helped these families identify evacuation routes, secure important documents, move valuables to higher ground. Sarah used her knowledge of who lived where, who was elderly or infirm, who had young children. Jacob used his engineering knowledge to assess which buildings were most at risk, which routes would stay passable longest. The work was exhausting, and the rejections hurt. But slowly a network formed. People who believed, who prepared, who agreed to watch for warning signs. Thomas appeared at Sarah's cabin on the 3rd day, looking uncomfortable. Sarah, I need to talk to you. She considered sending him away, but something in his expression made her pause. All right. My mother and father, their house is in the lower town. I know my father dismissed Jacob's warnings, but I saw the data. I saw the credentials. He looked at his feet. I think Jacob's right. And I don't want my parents to die because my father's too proud to listen. Sarah felt her anger at Thomas soften slightly. Whatever else he'd done, he loved his family. The best thing you can do is prepare them yourself. Move valuables upstairs, have an evacuation plan ready, watch the creek. If it starts to overflow, get them out immediately, whether they want to go or not. Will you show me the evacuation routes Jacob mapped out? Sarah did, spreading the maps across her table. Thomas studied them carefully, asking intelligent questions. When he left, he thanked her quietly. For what it's worth, he said at the door, I'm sorry. For how I treated you after the accident. You deserved better. Yes, I did, Sarah agreed. But thank you for saying it. On the morning of December 3rd, Sarah woke to the sound of running water, louder, faster than it should be. She wheeled to her window and saw the creek, swollen and angry, running high against its banks. Jacob arrived within the hour, his face grim. It's starting. Temperature spiked overnight, melting the mountain snow too fast. Creek's already at critical levels. He checked his pocket watch. Based on the rate of rise, we have maybe 4 to 6 hours before it overflows. We need to warn people. Already sent word to Doc Morrison and the families we prepared. They'll start spreading the warning. He knelt beside her chair. Sarah, I need to get you to safety first. Your cabin's on high enough ground, but if the flood is worse than predicted, I'm not leaving. People need to be warned, and I know this town better than anyone. I know who lives where, who needs help evacuating." She gripped his hands. "We do this together, remember?" Jacob looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. "Together then, but we stay safe. I can't—" His voice cracked slightly. "I can't lose you. You won't. We're going to save as many people as we can, and then we're going to build a future together." She kissed him firmly. "Now let's go warn this stubborn town that the flood is coming." They moved through Willowbrook like a storm, warning themselves. Jacob's wagon rolling down streets, while Sarah directed him to every house, every family. Some people saw the rising creek and needed no convincing. Others still resisted, right up until they heard the roar of water approaching. The flood was coming, and there was no more time for doubt. "He's breathing," Morrison announced. "Just shocked and stubborn. He'll live." Thomas knelt beside his father, relief and anger warring on his face. But there was no time for family reconciliation. More people were still coming from the lower town, and the flood showed no signs of abating. Sarah's cabin location, on the eastern edge of town at slightly higher elevation, suddenly became strategically crucial. It was above the flood line, but close enough to serve as a waypoint for evacuees and a base for rescue operations. "We need to move there," Sarah told Jacob. "We can see more of the evacuation routes. And we have supplies. My leather materials can be used for emergency repairs, bandages, ties." Jacob didn't argue. He pushed her wheelchair toward her cabin, Thomas and several other men following to help. As they moved, Sarah kept directing people, her voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority. "Henderson family, take the path behind my cabin to the church. Mrs. Sullivan, is your mother-in-law with you? Good, keep moving. Mr. Patterson, check the mill, make sure no one took shelter there." Her cabin became a command post and refuge. People streamed past and through, some stopping briefly to rest, others pressing on to the church and other high ground. Sarah's small home filled with refugees, children separated from parents, elderly folks needing to rest, injured people requiring attention. Doc Morrison set up a makeshift medical station on Sarah's porch. She worked beside him, her leather scraps becoming bandages and bindings, her strong thread stitching cuts, her skilled hands as useful here as they'd been making coin purses. The woman they'd all pitied, the burden they'd avoided, was now essential. Mrs. Henley arrived with her grandchildren, soaked and frightened. When she saw Sarah calmly treating injuries and directing operations, something shifted in her expression. "Thank you," she said simply, and there was no condescension in it, only genuine gratitude. "For the warnings, for this. My grandchildren are safe because of you and Jacob." Sarah nodded, already turning to the next person who needed help. There was no time for acknowledgement or vindication. There was only the work. Jacob organized rescue teams, sending able-bodied men back into the flood zone with specific instructions based on his knowledge of water flow and structural integrity. He knew which buildings were most at risk of collapse, which routes would stay passable longest, where the current would be strongest. "Henderson, take 3 men and check the eastern houses. Water shouldn't be as deep there. Anyone who stayed behind, get them out. Patterson, western route. Move fast. Those foundations won't hold much longer." Thomas worked alongside the rescue teams, following Jacob's instructions without question. Sarah watched him help an elderly woman to safety, saw the way he deferred to Jacob's expertise, and realized that crisis had a way of stripping away pretense. In the face of disaster, credentials and character mattered more than social standing. As afternoon gave way to evening, the water finally began to stabilize. It wasn't receding yet, but it wasn't rising either. The flood had reached its peak. Jacob returned from his final rescue run, bringing the last holdouts from the lower town. He was exhausted, his clothes torn and muddy, a cut on his forehead bleeding sluggishly. Sarah pulled him down beside her chair, cleaning and binding the wound with steady hands. Around them, her cabin and porch were packed with people, 57 by Sarah's count, but it felt right, necessary. This was what homes were for. Everyone's accounted for, Jacob said quietly. Few injuries, mostly minor. Some property damage, but everyone's alive, Sarah finished. Because you knew what was coming and gave us time to prepare. Because we both did. He took her hand. I had the knowledge, but you had the connections. You knew who needed help, where they were, how to reach them. This worked because we did it together. Around them, people were beginning to settle in for what would clearly be a long night. The water wouldn't recede quickly, and returning to damaged homes in darkness was foolish. Families huddled together, sharing blankets and quiet conversation. Children, exhausted from fear and excitement, dozed against their parents. Reverend Hutchins appeared, looking humbled and ashamed. He approached Sarah and Jacob where they sat on the porch, surrounded by the people they'd helped save. I owe you both an apology, he said quietly. I questioned your relationship, your motives. I was wrong. You saved this town today, and His voice cracked. I'm sorry. We didn't do it for apologies, Jacob said, but his voice wasn't harsh. We did it because it needed doing. Nevertheless, you have mine. Both of you. The Reverend looked around at the gathered townspeople. Everyone here owes you their lives or their loved ones' lives. That's not something we'll forget. As night fell, someone started a fire in Sarah's yard, carefully controlled, away from structures. People gathered around it for warmth, and gradually the shock began to give way to relief, then to something approaching celebration. They'd survived. They were together. The worst was over. Jacob sat on the ground beside Sarah's wheelchair, his back against it, her hand resting on his shoulder. Copper lay across both their laps, content with the unusual number of people to pet him. Around the fire, people talked quietly, sharing stories of the day, processing what had happened. Mrs. Garrett approached them, helping her husband walk. Howard Garrett looked like he'd aged 10 years in one day. His house was likely destroyed, his pride certainly shattered. He stood before Jacob and Sarah for a long moment, struggling with words. You saved my life, he said finally, when I'd done nothing but insult and dismiss you. When I'd treated you both with contempt. His voice was rough. I don't know how to thank you for that. You don't have to thank us, Sarah said gently. But you could listen next time. Trust that people might know things you don't, even if they don't look or live the way you expect them to. Garrett nodded slowly. That's fair. More than fair, he looked at Jacob. The council will need to rebuild, properly this time, with flood defenses. Would you be willing to help? Your expertise, your engineering knowledge? Jacob glanced at Sarah, a question in his eyes. She squeezed his shoulder encouragingly. I'll help, Jacob said, on one condition. We do it right. No cutting corners, no ignoring evidence because it's inconvenient. We build this town to last. Agreed. Garrett extended his hand, and after a moment Jacob took it. As the night deepened, the gathering around the fire took on an almost festive quality. Someone produced a harmonica, and music drifted through the cold air. Children who'd been terrified hours earlier now played tag around the cabin. Adults who'd been strangers that morning shared blankets and stories like old friends. Sarah watched it all with a sense of profound transformation. 6 months ago, she'd been alone on this porch, convinced her life was over, that she had nothing to offer anyone. Now she sat at the center of a community she'd helped save, beside a man she loved. Proof that strength came in forms people didn't always recognize. Thomas approached as the fire burned low, carrying 2 cups of coffee someone had managed to brew. He handed them to Sarah and Jacob, then settled nearby. I was wrong, he said without preamble. About everything. About leaving you after the accident. About thinking your disability made you less capable. About Jacob being unsuitable. He looked at Sarah directly. You're the strongest person I know. Stronger than I'll ever be. And I'm genuinely happy you found someone who sees that. Thank you, Thomas, Sarah said. That means something. Catherine, my fiancée, she's at the church with her family. When you meet her, you'll understand why I know I was wrong about you. He smiled slightly. She's a lot like you, actually. Strong, smart, doesn't let anyone tell her what she can't do. I'm lucky she's willing to marry me. Then we're both lucky, Sarah said, and meant it. We found the right people. As Thomas walked away, Jacob pulled Sarah's hand to his lips and kissed it gently. Ready to try to get some rest? It's going to be a long few days ahead, assessing damage, beginning repairs, getting people back into homes. I know, but we'll manage it. Together. Sarah looked at him, this quiet mountain man who'd seen her worth when no one else could. Jacob, will you stay? Not just tonight, but after. Help rebuild the town. Build a life here with me. I was hoping you'd ask. He stood and kissed her properly, not caring who might see. My place is with you now. Wherever you are, that's home. Around them, the people of Willowbrook settled in for the night, saved, humbled, and forever changed by the flood that had nearly destroyed them, and the two people who'd refused to let it happen. 3 days after the flood, the waters had receded enough for people to return to their homes and assess the damage. 20 houses in the lower town were destroyed beyond repair. 30 more sustained significant damage, but could be rebuilt. The general store, the mill, and several other businesses would need extensive reconstruction, but there had been no deaths, no serious injuries beyond a few broken bones and cuts. The town had survived because 2 people refused to let fear of judgment stop them from speaking truth. Sarah and Jacob worked alongside the community in the recovery efforts. Jacob's engineering expertise proved invaluable as he assessed structural damage and designed repairs that would withstand future floods. Sarah organized supply distribution, coordinating donations of food, clothing, and materials from neighboring towns. Her cabin remained a gathering place, people stopping by for guidance, supplies, or just the comfort of being somewhere that felt safe and organized. The woman they'd once avoided now found herself at the center of community life, and she handled it with the same calm competence she'd shown during the crisis. 6 months later, spring had arrived in Willowbrook, and with it came transformation. The town's reconstruction was well underway, guided by Jacob's flood control designs. New buildings stood on higher ground, reinforced against future water damage. A system of channels and barriers directed creek overflow away from populated areas. The town that emerged from the disaster was stronger, smarter, built to last. But more than the physical reconstruction, the community itself had changed. The flood had stripped away pretense and social barriers, forcing people to see each other clearly. Those who judged Sarah for her disability now recognized her strength. Those who dismissed Jacob as a hermit now respected his expertise and dedication. On a warm April morning, Sarah sat on her porch, the same porch where she'd once spent lonely hours watching life pass her by, surrounded by people. Young Mary Sullivan was learning leatherwork, her small hands carefully stamping a pattern under Sarah's patient guidance. 2 other children waited their turn while their mothers sat nearby. Chatting and sharing coffee, Jacob emerged from the cabin, carrying a wooden frame he'd built, perfectly sized to hold her latest project, a large leather wall hanging depicting the town and mountains, a commissioned piece for the rebuilt town hall. He set it down gently, examining the tooled landscape with appreciation. "Your best work yet," he said, kissing the top of her head. "Our work," Sarah corrected. "You designed the frame, mapped the proportions, helped me understand the perspective." I held the ruler. "You created art." Their easy partnership had become familiar to the town, no longer scandalous, but simply accepted as natural. They worked together, lived together. Jacob had moved most of his belongings down from the mountain cabin, though they kept it as a retreat for times when they needed peace and solitude. Mrs. Henley arrived with fresh bread, no longer bringing it as charity, but as the kind of neighborly gesture people made for friends. She settled into a chair and watched Sarah teach the children with obvious approval. "Town council meeting tomorrow," she said. "They're voting on Jacob's position as permanent town engineer. I expect it'll be unanimous. He'll accept if the terms are right," Sarah said. "He's particular about doing things properly, as he should be." "We've learned that lesson," Mrs. Henley smiled. "Though I hear there's another ceremony coming up soon?" Sarah felt warmth bloom in her chest. "Next month. Small wedding, just family and close friends. The whole town is your family now, dear." After what you and Jacob did, saving us all, people won't forget that. It was true. The flood had rewritten Sarah's story in the eyes of Willowbrook. She was no longer the tragic figure to be pitied, the burden to be avoided. She was Sarah Brennan, skilled craftswoman, capable leader, woman who'd helped save a town. The wheelchair was just something she used to get around, not the defining feature of who she was. Later that afternoon, Sarah wheeled down Main Street, fully rebuilt now with wider roads and better drainage. People greeted her by name, stopped to chat, asked her opinion on matters both trivial and important. Shop owners displayed her leather goods prominently, and she'd taken on 2 apprentices to help meet demand. She stopped at the site of her father's old store, now rebuilt and operating under new management. But a plaque beside the door read, "Brennan Building," honoring her father's memory and the family that had been part of Willowbrook's foundation. Thomas emerged from the store. He managed it now for his father, who'd stepped back after the flood, humbled and exhausted. Catherine was with him, visibly pregnant with their first child. "Sarah, good timing," Thomas said. "Catherine wanted to ask you something." Catherine knelt beside Sarah's chair, with the ease of someone who saw no awkwardness in it. "We're hoping you'd make something special for the baby. A leather-bound book, maybe. Something that will last as they grow. A gift they can treasure." "I'd be honored," Sarah said warmly. "Come by the cabin next week and we'll talk about the design." As they parted ways, Sarah continued to the church at the top of the hill, where Jacob was working with a crew on the final touches of the flood barrier system. He saw her coming and broke away, dirty and sweating but smiling. "Taking a break?" she asked. "For you, always." He settled on the ground beside her chair, wiping his face with a cloth. "How were the children today?" "Eager, talented. Mary's going to be exceptional if she keeps practicing, like her teacher." He took Sarah's hand, running his thumb over the calluses from her leather work, the good kind of rough, earned through skill and dedication. "I was thinking about the cabin. The mountain one." "Oh? We should go up there next week before the wedding. Spend a few days in the quiet, just us. Make sure we remember what that feels like before we get swept up in everything else." "I'd like that." Sarah leaned down and kissed him. "Though I don't think I could forget. You've made sure I always know I'm not alone. Neither of us is. Not anymore." They sat together as the sun tracked across the sky, watching the town bustle below them. Children played in the street. Merchants conducted business. Families went about their lives, ordinary and precious. All of them alive because 2 broken people chose to stand together when it mattered most. The wedding took place in early May, a simple ceremony in the church with the whole town in attendance. Sarah wore a dress made from fabric Catherine had helped her select, cream-colored but entirely new. Not a repurposed wedding dress, but a fresh start. Jacob wore his old army dress uniform, brushed clean and fitting him again after months of hard physical labor. Doc Morrison officiated, having been ordained for just this purpose. Reverend Hutchins attended but had graciously stepped aside, acknowledging that this couple needed someone who'd believed in them from the start. As they exchanged vows, Sarah looked out at the gathered community, Mrs. Henley dabbing her eyes, the Pattersons beaming, Thomas and Catherine holding hands, the children she taught fidgeting in their seats, even Howard Garrett, humbled but present, nodding his approval. "I, Sarah Brennan, take you, Jacob Cole, to be my husband. In strength and in struggle, in joy and in sorrow, for all the days we're given, I, Jacob Cole, take you, Sarah Brennan, to be my wife. In light and in darkness, in healing and in hope, for as long as we both shall live." The reception was held in Sarah's yard, expanded now with additional space Jacob had cleared. Tables groaned under contributed food. Music played. People danced. Jacob lifted Sarah from her chair and held her close, swaying to the melody, her feet dangling but her heart soaring. "Happy?" he asked softly. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered. "When the accident happened, I thought my life was over. Thought I'd lost everything that mattered. And now? Now I know I was wrong. I didn't lose everything. I lost the wrong things. The things that didn't matter as much as I thought they did." She cupped his face in her hands. "And I found what I actually needed. Purpose, respect, love, you. We found each other, Jacob corrected. Two people who'd forgotten how to hope, remembering together. As evening fell and lanterns were lit around the yard, Sarah looked at the gathering with profound contentment. A community quilt was being created, every family contributing a square made from fabric scraps, including pieces from her repurposed wedding dress. Each square told a story of the flood, the rescue, the rebuilding. Together, they'd create something beautiful from shared survival. The quilt would hang in the rebuilt town hall, a permanent reminder of what they'd endured and overcome. But more than that, it would remind them of simple truth, that strength came in unexpected forms, that worth wasn't measured by ability to walk or stand, and that the strongest communities were built by people brave enough to see each other clearly. Years later, when Sarah was asked to speak at the dedication of the town's new flood defense system, she stood, metaphorically, before the crowd and told their story. Not to glorify herself or Jacob, but to remind everyone of what they'd learned. The cruelest wounds aren't always the ones that break our bodies, she said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. Sometimes they're the wounds of being unseen, unheard, dismissed as less than we are. The accident took my ability to walk. But the town's abandonment after, that almost took my spirit. She paused, finding Jacob's eyes in the crowd, drawing strength from his steady presence. We all face moments when life breaks us, when we lose what we thought defined us. The question isn't whether we'll be broken. We will be. The question is what we build from the pieces. She gestured to the town around them, rebuilt and resilient. We built this together. Not just the buildings and flood walls, but something more important. A community that sees worth in everyone, that listens to wisdom wherever it comes from, that stands together when it matters most. The crowd erupted in applause, and Sarah felt the weight of it, not burden but blessing. She'd survived the accident, the abandonment, the flood. She'd rebuilt not just her life, but her entire understanding of what life could be. As she wheeled away from the podium, Jacob met her with their daughter, 2 years old now. Brown hair and dark eyes like her father, stubborn determination like her mother. The child reached for Sarah, and she pulled her onto her lap, kissing her forehead. "Tell me about the flood, Mama," the little girl said, as she did almost daily. "Another time, Emma," Sarah said, the name chosen deliberately to honor Jacob's first daughter, ensuring she was never forgotten. "Right now, let's go home." Home was the cabin on the edge of town, expanded now to accommodate their growing family, Jacob's workshop, and Sarah's thriving leatherwork business. Home was the mountain cabin they escaped to when they needed quiet. Home was Willowbrook itself, transformed from a place of isolation into a place of belonging. But mostly, home was wherever they were together. Two people who'd learned that strength wasn't about standing tall, but about refusing to fall, even when the whole world tried to break you. Two people who'd discovered that the greatest love often came from the most unexpected places, and that being truly seen was worth more than walking could ever be. As they settled on their porch that evening, watching the sun set over the mountains, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from paralysis to purpose, from abandonment to acceptance. From brokenness to wholeness of a different kind. She'd once thought the wagon accident was the worst thing that could happen to her. Now she understood it was simply the thing that led her to where she needed to be. Not despite her disability, but through it, around it, with it as part of who she was. Jacob's hand found hers in the dimming light, and their daughter dozed between them, safe and loved. Copper, impossibly ancient now but still loyal, lay at their feet. The town spread below them, lights beginning to twinkle in windows, smoke rising from chimneys, life continuing its beautiful, ordinary rhythm. "What are you thinking?" Jacob asked softly. Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. "That I'm glad I couldn't reach that book the day you stopped by. Glad I dropped it, glad you picked it up, glad you saw me. I'll always see you," Jacob promised. "All of you, everything you are." And in the end, that was all anyone needed, to be truly seen, fully known and loved anyway. Not for what they could or couldn't do, but for who they were at their core. Sarah Brennan had learned to survive alone on her island. But she'd learned something better too, that the best kind of strength came from standing together, even when you couldn't stand at all.